to infinity and beyond. What does that mean? Infinity is an abstract mathematical concept. So he's invoking this jargon, this mathematical word. And he says beyond. What does he mean?
No border,
No
no
limits.
frontier.
This is good.
You can go.
This is good.
Anywhere.
Yeah, that's what we're supposed to get from the message, right? That there are no limits on our imagination or what we can accomplish.
Yeah.
Okay, but can it also mean that Buzz Lightyear has no understanding of mathematics? There's clearly a failure of science communication, at least in mathematics communication, in Buzz Lightyear's understanding of what the concept of infinity is. And this is important. I want to emphasize this meaning, because science is not good at imbuing meaning. Data does not equal information. And scientists are really good at getting data. This is what scientists do. But the data doesn't necessarily inform us. So now we have to interpret the data in order to turn that into information. But information does not equal knowledge. So scientists might be very good at data, pretty good at information, and weak at knowledge. And then lastly, knowledge does not equal meaning. So scientists start at the upper left-hand corner of this slide and they work their way down badly to the lower right. But our audiences, our public audiences, they look down in the lower right and only reluctantly work their way to the upper left. So what we need to do is bridge between the data and the meaning. And this isn't what scientists are trained for. This is what humanists are trained for. This is what artists are trained for. So in order to get from data to meaning, we need to make sense of things. We make sense of complex ideas by telling stories. It turns out that there's some good science on this. If you search the library for articles, studies on sense making, they reinforce this idea that people are wired to make sense of complex ideas by turning them into stories. So if we as scientists want people to understand the complexity of our ideas, then we need to be the ones who turn them into stories for the public. Terrific. What makes a good story? So I put this into Google this morning. I was like, if I'm going to give this talk, I should have some idea of what makes a good story. And the first thing that came up was bad decisions make good stories. But not everybody who makes a bad decision is skilled at turning it into a good story. In 8th grade, middle school, when I was young, this is what they told me made a good story. Stories have to have a beginning, they have to have a middle, they have to have an end. Well, thanks very much. So clearly there's more to telling a good story. It's more complicated than what we were told when we were in grade school. So here's what I want to do. I want you to tell me what makes a good story.
Character whom you can relate to.
So good stories, the audience or the reader, they will relate to at least one of the characters. Okay, terrific. We need good characters that the audience can relate to. What else makes a good story? We like that. We want emotion in our stories. Now let's move up. If you got to believe in the story.
Yeah.
So a story has to have credibility, has to have emotion, and it has to have characters that we can identify with. These are all characteristics of stories that we enjoy. I do think we're missing something important. Edward.
A good story, I think it must have suddenlies. And suddenly, something happened.
Okay, so an element of surprise, something unexpected, something that holds your attention would help improve a story. I like where you're going there. For me, a good story has to have some tension. It has to have some type of conflict, which sure enough is up on our 8th grade poster. It has to have some unresolved question in it, because that motivates us to keep reading the story. We want to know what's the answer to the question. So we're already familiar with several of the elements of a good story because they're incorporated into science. The question, the tension, the curiosity that we want to instill in the reader that keeps them wanting to learn more. But there are areas, in particular emotion and characters, that we need to work on.
There is a creature alive today.
Tell me when you recognize it. Just put your hand up.
Millions of years of evolution. Without change.
That's good though. What is it?
Without passion.
Godzilla?
And
Not
without
Godzilla.
logic.
This is good.
It lives to kill. A mindless eating machine. It will attack and devour anything.
Can anybody recognize these images?
Is the sea bottom?
This is the bottom of the ocean. This is the original movie trailer for Jaws. Spielberg starts the movie trailer with something that he thinks his audience is familiar with. Then the audience, they say, oh, I know what that is. That's one of those Jacques Cousteau specials. But there's a couple of things off. Visually, it looks like exactly what you think, like you're very familiar. But the narration isn't quite right. The narration is foreboding. And the music is off. It doesn't sound like Jacques Cousteau underwater music.
It is as if God created the devil and gave him Jaws.
You thought it was an underwater documentary about the ocean with fuzzy little clownfish, and it turns out it's a shark attack movie. Does that not give you goosebumps? Does that not create this unexpected surprise sense of tension? Like, what the heck is going to happen next? If you want to know, you got to buy a ticket. All right, I want to show you something that's much more recent. If you've seen this movie and you're not embarrassed, go ahead and raise your hand.
If you get tired waiting for the waves out there, just come and kick it with us. We don't have to wait for the action.
Or when you get tired of pipe, come surf the railways.
Bethany Hamilton is holding nothing.
You know this movie, Irene.
Looks like she has a real future. And with her heart, her will, she'll go far.
Thursday night's a full moon. We're all gonna go surfing.
Sorry, Mom. I really wanted to go night surfing. Would you have let me go?
No.
What's this movie about?
Maybe a holidays on the beach.
Holiday on the beach, that sounds good.
Surfing competition.
Could be a surfing flick with lots of good action photography. We certainly see some of that in the trailer. What else could this movie be about? Summer love, boy meets girl. They gave us that element, right? Teenage rebellion. Mom, would you have let me go? I don't know. So we see lots of common themes. Okay, well, let's see. Because as you might have already guessed, this is not a summer romance movie. What kind of movie might this be?
Sorry, Mom. I don't know. Do you believe we get to come out here every day?
You think it's a summer romance movie, it's really a shark attack movie. We're gonna start with a movie, a story, a genre that's familiar to you. You think you know what's going on, you're like, yeah, I've seen this movie. But you haven't. This is what we call, in our proposals, the however moment. You think it's a summer romance, however, it's really a shark attack movie. When we want to reach people and take them to a new place, we can't just plunge into the new place. We have to start in an area where they're familiar. We have to get them being like, I know what this is about. And then we move them from the familiar place to the unfamiliar place because we threaten them with ignorance. We say, you think you understand everything about what we're about to do or say. However, it's really something that you don't understand. And if you stick with me, I will walk you slowly from the places that you're familiar to the places where you're uncomfortable, and this is critically important, without making you feel stupid along the way. The trailer is like a science proposal. When we write a 15-page project description, and in the States we send it to the National Science Foundation, it is like a science trailer. It's a brief teaser that says, if you buy a ticket, you get to see how this story comes out. And we have to have all the elements of a good story in our proposals without the resolution. Because if it's resolved, then the review panel will say, oh, all the work has already been done. So that every proposal, every science proposal is like a cliffhanger. And every science presentation can have that resolution because, well, they've already bought the tickets, they're already in the tent, and now you want them to learn something along the way. There is a pattern that exists in storytelling. And if you're familiar with Joe Campbell's work, it's called The Hero's Journey. And here I've pulled a diagram that you can't read that shows how the movie that came out the year after Jaws, Star Wars, maps onto the hero's journey. And the hero's journey exemplifies this move from what's called the ordinary world, the familiar world, the world in which the hero is comfortable, into the unfamiliar world. Here, it's called the special world. In the hero's journey, the hero moves from places that they know, and then they accept challenges that they're unfamiliar with. By taking on those challenges, which, by the way, might kill them, they grow as a person, they transform, and then typically they re-enter the old world that they're familiar with, but they have been changed. If you do this well, and the audience identifies with what's going on, they will think of themselves as the hero. It's exactly the same reason that we root for Luke Skywalker, because some part of us in the audience in a good story with identifiable characters feels like what Luke Skywalker is feeling. When Luke Skywalker's afraid, we get that emotion of being fearful. When he's joyful, we get that emotion of feeling joyful because we identify with that character. Now that makes a lot of sense. But that means the audience needs someone to identify with when we present. Who are they going to identify with?
The scientist?
You are the heroes. When you go up on the stage, if you want people to identify with your work, if you want them to enjoy that work and make meaning out of it and be hanging on your every word, then you must present yourself as the hero. If you're going to be a superhero, you have to understand what are your superpowers. Superman can fly. He's got super strength. He's got the X-ray heat vision thing. I don't even know if they still do that. What we do when we evaluate scientists, even as other scientists, is we reduce you to the most simplified caricatures. These are exaggerations of yourself. These are cartoon versions of you as a superhero. It's not you. It's something that people project onto you, and they're going to do it. Your audience will do it. Your colleagues will do it. Your students will do it. If you help them, if you guide them in this process of oversimplifying you, creating a caricature of you, then you are going to put in their heads the caricature that you want, rather than the caricature that they create for you. So know what your superpowers are. I want an example from the audience of someone who has a superpower.
I can see inside matter.
I'd love that. So one of your superpowers is you can see inside matter.
Yeah.
This makes you sound like Superman without the flying part, you know? This is good. So now we know your superpower, and we can create for you the superhero that your audiences and your colleagues can identify with. Good, we're going to do another one.
I can see the invisible, like beyond.
I like that. You can see back in time. Because you reach into your telescope with your vision.
I also thought of that, but back in time I would prefer to see forward in time. Okay.
Okay, so you're working on it. Yeah. But this is good. Now we can say, look, we're going to oversimplify you. And it sounds like a diminishment of you. And it is. Because we've now created a comic book character out of you, which is kind of a juvenile thing to do. But we're accepting that people are going to do it anyway, and we're guiding them through this process of oversimplification so that they can identify with you. Because what they're not going to identify with is the doctorate in astrophysics who, I don't know, creates mini Big Bang particle collision, something or other that they don't understand and they can't relate to. So we're making it easier for our audience. All right, we're still talking about now the elements of a good story.
And by the way, you know, when you're telling these little stories, here's a good idea. Have a point. It makes it so much more interesting for the listener.
This is what we're trying to do. We're trying to consider the listener's needs. The listener needs to oversimplify you. The listener needs to identify with you. The listener needs a reason to listen to you. The surprise, the unexpected, the tension. If you have a point, it makes it so much easier for the listener. And I cannot tell you how many first draft manuscripts I get from my students, and they go on for 15 pages, and I will say, what is your point? If they're summarized, why are they reading? Why are they summarizing? Why are they citing these articles and not those articles? Where do these articles support a theme, or a thesis, or a point? Because it will make it so much more interesting for your audience. They will be struggling to understand your point. They will be questioning your point in their own minds. Is this point correct? Is it incorrect? Do I agree with it? Do I disagree with it? Understand your point before you even begin your presentation. What is the point of your research?
The point is to add something for conservation biology.
Is to what? Add something to conservation biology? Okay, that's a snooze. But we're almost, that puts me to sleep. That's boring. Add something, you know? Could you make an argument or a thesis about conservation biology? Has that emerged in your research yet?
Yeah.
Give me that.
Well, I'm placing the sacred knowledge of people in the useless of that, conserving the nature.
Okay, so yeah, I'm going to turn this into something that sounds more like an argument. You could argue that if we understood the sacred knowledge of indigenous people, that this knowledge would result in more effective management of biodiversity or something like that. Okay, that sounds like a point. If people can't disagree with you, it's not a point. For example, where did you start? You started with add something to conservation biology. And I'm supposed to say, oh, well, that sounds like it's full of crap. There's nothing for me to disagree with. And that means you have no point. And this is why, as scientists, especially as junior scientists, we often present ourselves without a point. Because we're afraid of being contradicted. We're afraid of being disagreed with. We're afraid of the conflict or the disapproval or the rejection that we might feel from our advisors, our colleagues, or our audience. So we'll go through our performance without a point, ensuring that there's no disagreement. If you're not willing to risk disagreement, you are boring your audience to tears. So this is how we approach that very first slide. How do we move from data to meaning? We said, I need to bring my graduate students together with faculty, scientists, humanists, and artists. We went out into the desert in Arizona. We stayed at this ranch, and we created a workshop. It began with a poster session, just like a lot of poster sessions that we do in science. But the second day, we created 3 themes, and they were improvisational theater, visual arts, and music. Improvisational theater builds in scientists an empathy for their audience so that they can see the science from the audience's point of view. This is a way of overcoming what Darius called the curse of knowledge, because you forget what it's like to be naive or ignorant and outside the expertise that you've acquired now. Improvisational theater helps with that. But we add to it the music, and we add to it the visual arts, because these are modes of creative expression that aren't just theatrical, they aren't monologues, but they're these additional modes that we want the scientists to be able to tap into, and specifically want them to do it with other people. So when we painted, we just didn't paint by ourselves. We put a blindfold on one person and a brush in their hand. And we put somebody else behind them and require the other person to do the painting through the hand of the first person. Again, we wanted to create these empathetic connections. So this is what the workshop was intended to do. Develop empathy, move the audience from merely presenting their science to performing their science, elicit emotion, both in the participants, and get better at eliciting emotion in the audience, and be more comfortable being vulnerable. The vulnerability that is required of you to get up on the stage and present your science or present your monologue. Those feelings are the way the audience is going to relate to you and your hero's journey. Because what they feel, they will remember. What they hear or what they see, they will forget. Unless it's attached to some strong emotion. Then they will access the memory through the emotion. This is a picture of a former student of mine, Allison Hendricks. She plays the cello. Now, she played in high school. She went to engineering school. She now has her undergraduate degree in environmental engineering. And she didn't really play the cello so much anymore because there isn't a lot of time for orchestra when you're an engineering undergraduate student. But I invited Allison to come to this workshop and I asked her to bring the cello. When it was time for the music module, Allison and 4 other students were nowhere to be found because they'd heard about a cave nearby in the Arizona desert that has an infamous reputation for druggies and people who are hanging out, and there's the whole subculture around this cave. And of course they wanted to go visit the cave. They convinced Allison to bring the cello because these other people that you see just a little bit of in the picture, they're soundscape ecologists. They record the sounds of the natural environment, and that, for example, bats, insects, and then they try and deduce the health of the ecosystem and the biodiversity in the sounds that they've recorded. So they're very technical in their sound recording, and they're very natural science in the way they interpret the data. They convinced Allison to go to the cave because they wanted to record her in this one room that they heard about. So here's little Allison with her cello, and they're literally dragging her cello through the cave because some of the passageways in order to get to this room are only this big. She has to push her cello out in front of her when one of the recording technicians is ahead, and they pull it forth. And there are 2 other rooms that you have to go through past the drug addicts in order to get to this one. And at each one, Allison stopped. And she's like, this is good, this is the room, don't you think? And they were like, no, this isn't the room we had in mind at all. There's another, 1,000 feet that we have to crawl to get to the room that we want. How do you think Allison felt? At this point, she has to make a choice. Either I'm grabbing my cello and I'm turning around and I'm crawling back those other several hundred feet and I'm getting the hell out of here, or I'm gonna keep going. And at each moment, she kept going. They finally got to the room. And now, Allison realizes she has to perform. She didn't bring any music. She just brought the damn cello. So they're like setting up the lights and they're setting up the recording equipment and they're like, go. It's like, okay, I guess I'm just gonna play. Whatever comes to mind. They recorded that. Day earlier, I didn't show it in the cello. We recorded Allison earlier. And one of our political science faculty, who used to be a rock and roll musician before he got a doctorate, he said, Allison, you're holding back. She says, well, yeah, I'm a little intimidated. You're this famous musician guy, and I'm just like a high school cello player. He tried to bring her out. It didn't work. But then Allison went into the cave, and she brought all of her fears and vulnerabilities and insecurities with her. She set up and she played this. She re-entered this more familiar world when we all got together in plenary session. And they asked her, would it be okay if we played your cello recording for the entire group? And she said, okay. How do you think she felt about that? Not too good. Because at that moment, everyone's going to hear this thing that she had no confidence in when they recorded. Everyone's going to hear her mistakes and her inconsistencies, but at that moment, nobody cares. We all listened to it and we thought it was like the most beautiful music we'd ever heard. I know it's not the most beautiful music we've ever heard, right? But we care about Allison. We identify strongly with what she's trying to do. And when we hear what she's produced, we see that in a context that helps make it beautiful. Here's the point. When you get up on the stage, your tendency is to be self-protective. You're frightened, you're a little insecure, you're subject to judgment. And so right away, our intuition, our self-protective instinct is to say things like, oh, I didn't really have a lot of time for this presentation. Oh, I haven't really finished. Oh, I'm sorry if you can't hear me in the back. Oh, we say a lot of things that distance ourselves from our audience. And we want that distance so that we stay safe, so that our egos are a little bit protected. This does absolutely nothing for your audience. The audience doesn't care about you. They want you to be out there like Superman or Wonder Woman. They want you to be the hero, not the person who shirks away from the existential crisis, not the person who presents themselves as afraid to be vulnerable, as afraid to risk death. They want you to take them through your hero's journey in this presentation. And if you get up there and you're okay with being vulnerable, and you can allow them to identify with you, and then you can bring them from a world that they are familiar with to a world they're unfamiliar with, without making them feel stupid along the way, they are going to love you for this.